All right, joining me in my hot mess of a hairdo is Joe Szymanski from Elections Daily. Joe, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. Very good to be back.
So there were local elections in Pennsylvania this week, and there was some notable stuff that happened. You want to give a grand overview, I guess, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, of course. Big stuff happening in Pennsylvania, as it normally is. We usually have our primaries in the middle of May, no matter what year it is. And of course, off years and even years are no different. There as well, you would think an off year municipal primary didn't really have much, but that's never the case in Pennsylvania. Some of the big things that were going on, there were multiple state legislative special elections, the most prominent of which was one happening in Senate District 22. This is the Lackawanna County-based seat. Joe Biden won it by 9 points, but being up there in that northeast part, that is a part that is trending away from Democrats, but it was a Democratic hold. In that area of things, we had four ballot referendums on the ballot, but three were constitutional amendments, and amendments 1 and 2 were probably some of the most controversial ballot referendum amendments in Pennsylvania's history. Usually these pass with flying colors, but these were certainly probably some of the most partisan and controversial ballot amendments in history that were certainly specifically designed to target the emergency powers that were being used by the Wolf administration, and now will hurt the emergency. Since they have passed, they will now hurt the emergency powers of every governor that comes after him. And finally, there were two mayoral elections in big cities that had Democratic mayors. They had Democratic primaries, Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, in which both Democratic incumbents lost. And I'm sure we'll want to go into more detail on the events in Pittsburgh, I'm sure.
Oh, for sure, for sure. But I guess just sort of a general question about the ballot measures that were on the ballot. Given the, as you said, the partisan lean of both the positions, is the fact that the yes vote won on these measures a good sign for Republicans for next year, considering they were the ones who may have been supportive of limiting the governor's powers?
Well, that's a hard question to say. Pennsylvania has closed primaries, but independents were allowed to come out and vote on the referendums. But that does mean that independent turnout will likely be down in a primary year, in a close state like Pennsylvania. But what it does say, I do think, is that Republicans, or at least in some places, are quite motivated. You saw some huge numbers on election day turnout, which is starting to certainly become much more Republican favored with the expansion of mail and absentee balloting in states like Pennsylvania. Certainly, election day voting is becoming the more Republican day. And it's been pretty clear, quite honestly, that Republicans turn out heavily in multiple parts of the state, but most specifically, I would say in the central part of the state.
Oh yeah, you noted that, by the way. It was the more Democratic trending parts of the state that saw the bigger yes over performance.
Yes, it's been interesting. We still are waiting on some mail-in ballots in some places, but I think the big shock has to be in Philadelphia right now. Last I checked, Amendment 1 was still over 30% in Philadelphia, which, I mean, to put in perspective, former President Trump got only about 18% of the vote there in his 2020 run. And I've heard mail-in ballots are almost all done in Philadelphia. So the fact that is over 30%, Amendment 1, which is the one that really cajoles the emergency powers and the emergency declarations of the governor of Pennsylvania. That's when you overperform like that, it doesn't matter if yes is underperforming President Trump's margin by a couple of points in certain counties out west. If yes is overperforming his margin by double digits in the largest county in the state.
But just to play devil's advocate, I'm maybe wondering that maybe some of the yes votes are people who are Democrats who maybe think that the governor's powers may have gone too far a bit, but are otherwise Democratic voters. Is that also a possibility?
I think that is very much a possibility. I talked to a friend of mine who is a Democrat, who is a progressive Democrat, who did vote yes on Amendment 1, and he lives in Harrisburg. He lives in Dauphin County, and he did not vote yes on Amendment 2, but he did vote yes on Amendment 1. And when stuff like that, that's a very limited example for my life, but it did pass in Dauphin County, which was a Biden +9 county in the fall. Again, when it's passing in a place like Dauphin, that does mean you are probably getting some Democratic voters on the overlap. And I think you are. I do think in some of these progressive areas, that you think of more Democratic areas where restrictions have been heavier at the local level to some certain extent, you might have to wonder if there is some backlash among a small percentage of Democratic voters uh, over these restrictions, and whether or not that kind of came to play in this ballot referendum.
Right. And on the Senate district, that the special election that took place in Lackawanna, I was actually talking with a CA conservative earlier in the afternoon. We were talking about sort of the north part of England, and how some of that area is sort of historically Labor, but is trending more towards the Tories. Is this a similar dynamic that's happening in northeastern Pennsylvania, like Lackawanna and Luzerne?
Yes, certainly. Lackawanna less so. Scranton this Lackawanna is the home of Scranton, which is still in its deepest depths, still quite blue in the middle of the city there. But certainly across it, it is certainly trending red up north in Pennsylvania. For the most part, you see places like Luzerne, Schuylkill, Carbon counties, Lackawanna, even to a certain extent. No longer are you really, I think, in normal years, are you going to see, Democrats get double-digit margins in Lackawanna and then be close in places like Schuylkill, Luzerne, and Carbon. That's not going to happen anymore. Carbon and Schuylkill are now solidly Republican counties. Luzerne
Yeah,
is very quickly trending to that as a solid Republican county.
I think it's Schuylkill. I think now has more registered Republicans.
Yes, I mean the trends up in the Northeast, really past Monroe County, which is the home of of the Pocono Islands, which is a more touristy base, which is why that's kind of stayed blue to a certain extent, and also closest to some parts of the New York City, they have some
Right.
commuters in there.
It's
But
arguably trending blue, in fact.
yeah, arguably Monroe is trending blue, but other than Monroe County, that northeast part of Pennsylvania is probably the only area that's is another area that's kind of similar to the Southwest. It's very heavily white. It was very heavily working class, dependent on mining and manufacturing up in the Northeast, more so mining. There was a lot of coal mining that happened up in that northeastern part of Pennsylvania. So the fact that you know the one it's the northeast part is basically the south is basically how it's it's just the way that it's going there. It's very similar in demographics. Again, not super educated, quite white up there. So that's why you're really seeing this trend. It's the same part that you've seen across the country. And I think it is fair to say that it is comparable again to the north part of England in some cases, where again, it's very heavily white, not as educated areas that are trending towards the more conservative party.
Um, Now you mentioned, I think this is probably going to be, generally the second half of the stuff that we talk about, but there were some victories for progressives in the mayoral primaries. But I want to talk about Harrisburg first because it sort of fits into a general region of South Central Pennsylvania, which is arguably sort of going the other way from NEPA or SWP, Southwest Pennsylvania, in the trends that you mentioned there. I think that in this sort of this general region, it's like a historically Republican region that is becoming that's really going the direction of the Philly area in a sense.
Well, yeah, Dauphin County has always been different from the rest of South Central Pennsylvania in that fact that just because of the location of Harrisburg, which has had a decently sized African American population for quite some time, it has always made Dauphin the most democratic. I think the counties that people are talking about now are Cumberland, Dauphin, York, and Lancaster. Dauphin is by far the most democratic of them. It will regularly vote for Democrats the past decade in statewide races. It was the only one of those four to vote for Joe Biden, voted for Biden by 9 points. Again, you have a lot of government workers who live in the area. It's more educated. And again, Harrisburg is by far and away the deepest blue seat here. But this was a very interesting mayoral primary here. There were a lot of candidates. The incumbent Eric Pappenfuss. There are no term limits on the Harrisburg mayor. He was going for a third term, Pappenfuss. But he had come into some controversy kind of for two reasons. One, they kind of felt there were certain aspects of the party who thought his leadership under COVID and kind of in his second term hasn't been as great as they wanted it to. And then two, he caused himself some own controversy when he endorsed Republican State Senator John DeSanto, who represents most of Dauphin County, including Harrisburg, over Democrat George Scott, in their 2020 general election. He endorsed the Republican over the Democrat. So that kind of brought him under a twofold fire here. And then it did get him a couple of key primary challengers. Probably the most highest profile would have been City Council President Wanda Williams, who is an African-American female. And Williams ended up winning on the night by about 61 votes.
And I'm
So
guessing,
it was,
given his expectations, I'm guessing that was closer than expected.
we knew it was going to be close, but it wasn't It wasn't like the other race that I know we're going to talk about. It was not surprising that happened to his fall, not necessarily. He wasn't necessarily considered a moderate by any means, or even really an establishment Democrat. But he had a lot of people considered that he kind of got himself into too much trouble in the end. He had ticked off too many people in the city, and in the end, just barely didn't have enough votes.
So more local and personal factors rather than national ones.
Yes, I would certainly say there was a lot more personal and local factors here than national trends in Harrisburg. Like I said, Harrisburg's been a deep blue city for a long time now, but this is certainly more personal factors here. As I said, I think what really did him in to get these serious primary challengers, and I think his eventual loss, I think his endorsement of the Republican State Senator DeSanto, I think could definitely be seen as kind of a turning point in his issues.
Just a fun random fact about Dauphin County. I thought it was pronounced Dauphin for some reason, but I believe that all the local office holders are actually Republicans. Despite
it's been a very weird thing, and it's kind of this weird thing with these off year. A lot of these local, they're not held in midterm years in Pennsylvania. They're held in these off year elections. You're talking about county auditors, county commissioners, the recently elected auditor general,
Tim DeFore.
was elected in 2015 as a Republican in Dauphin, which was again a different time. But then he was popular enough in which they left him unopposed in 2019, of all years, where South Central Pennsylvania was an area that saw Democratic gains in certain parts of places like in Dauphin and in Lancaster and in York. So Dauphin has surprisingly been able to be close but stable for Republicans at that local level. But I do think that is in part due to the fact that these elections happen for them in these odd year elections and not in a midterm year where you see it happen in a lot of other states where they happen in midterm years.
So now we get to the creme de la creme, and that is what happened in Pittsburgh. Now, just to give some context, it has not escaped my attention that what has been happening in the last few years in the Allegheny County area. I believe this you mentioned it. It was about a couple nights ago. Bill Peduto losing a re-election. I think he was more generally a progressive who lost to another progressive, or was it more different dynamic than that?
I think you get some argument on that depending on who you talk to. There were some people who think that Peduto was kind of, the just this old establishment guy. There'd be some who didn't agree with that, who say that Peduto himself kind of ran against the establishment his first time around, that he wasn't necessarily, he was this big union guy. He had the backing of much of the unions in Pittsburgh. He was a big union guy, so not necessarily a big establishment, but I think that there's fair to say that he was certainly out left winged by Ed Gainey in this race.
And that, by the way, fits into a broader narrative that's been happening in the last few years. In 2018, this was the first time that the first blow to the Pittsburgh Democratic machine was in 2018 when two members of the Costa family lost their primaries and state representative to Summer Lee and Sarah Innamorato. And since then, it has been a bloodbath. I think you had DeFazio losing to Bethany Hallam, who I'm hoping, at-large Allegheny County councilor, who I'm hoping to have on the show next week. And then following year, pro-life Democrat Adam Ravenstall losing to Emily Kincaid. And then you had what happened in Pittsburgh. Is there anything else in Allegheny County besides that? Talk about Pittsburgh, but also talk about anything else in Allegheny County that was in that narrative.
Well, yeah, and this is kind of, I think the real key thing here is that when people think about, Southwest Pennsylvania, they think it's a lot of older people. It's a losing population, but the city of Pittsburgh is kind of different. The city of Pittsburgh in the past decade has kind of had a sort of resurgence, mainly in the medical field of things. UPMC has become, shall we say, incredibly powerful in the medical field in the Pittsburgh area. And that is bringing in then a lot of white, educated, decently wealthy voters then. And when you talk about these younger, white, educated, wealthier voters, these are the type of people who are voting for progressive Democrats. And,
Yeah.
Pittsburgh, I mean, it should be said that, there is history here. Ed Gainey will become the first black mayor in the city of Pittsburgh, which is historic in its own fact, because Pittsburgh has never really had higher than about a 25% of its population being black. I believe its current black population is only about 25% of its city's residents. So there is a history to that. But Gainey's victory was not necessarily driven in the African-American sectors of the city. It was also driven by huge victories in areas of the city that are becoming wider. People would call it gentrified areas of the city, where you're seeing the type of voter that I talk to. And again, this is a trend this is an election that I would say more is because of the national level, where you're seeing kind of the trends that you see in cities across America, where, again, these more educated, younger and whiter voters are putting in progressives because more on the backs of them.
And an example of this this happening last year was in St. Louis, when Cory Bush ran it up in the majority white precincts of St. Louis, while Lacey Clay was not able to make it up, but he did win the majority black precincts. And that was a trend I think you saw also nationally between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is, like, I think we mentioned, of course, the Pittsburgh Democratic machine, which, was the driver of, Southwest Pennsylvania and how blue it was for most of the 1900s. I mean, we're going back decades and decades of how blue. I mean, this recent very red turn of Southwest Pennsylvania, I know to a lot of our younger friends doesn't seem that, different, but to people who have been around for a long time, the fact of, how red parts of the states are, of that side of the state is outside of Allegheny, is not typical. This is not a typical thing, what's been going on these last 4 years in that part of the state. And Allegheny, but with Pittsburgh, with that kind of that losing of power in the area, and the fact that Allegheny is now kind of this blue speck surrounded by a lot of red, it means that they lose power. And I really do think that the fact that Peduto has lost here, in what I think almost every analyst would say is a stunner. I don't think anyone expected that going into the night. I don't think I heard anyone say it going into the night. It's kind of the last nail in the coffin. I do think, and I think a lot of people will be surprised by that the Pittsburgh machine is dead before the Philadelphia machine. But I think that's quite clear that the Pittsburgh machine is dead while the Philadelphia machine still marches on.
But in a sense, the establishment Democratic machine in Pittsburgh has sort of been seeing its power shift towards, I guess, a more progressive base in Philadelphia. And I think that an example of this, not to say that there's not a progressive base in Pittsburgh now, because they're now the ones deciding elections, but the shift, has been in a more progressive direction generally, and also towards the east specifically. And to me, a good example of this last year was when the preferred candidate of the Democratic machine in Pittsburgh for Auditor General, Michael Lamb, lost the primary to Nina Ahmed. And I think that was a classic example of that, who, by the way, went on to lose the general election to the Republican. But I think it's an example. I think that the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania is becoming more progressive because the balance of power is shifting towards the cities, away from the more rural areas that it once held in. It's now the cities that are dominating those primaries, and
that's absolutely the case. And I think the auditor primary, which was certainly one of the first signs of that, the fact that we did have split opposition out east, and then we really only had Lamb dominating the western part of the state. The fact that he lost while dominating Pittsburgh 90-10 basically over everyone else. Hey,
yeah,
it's certainly a new era in Pennsylvania, but I do think it does mean that the old school, what we would think of as the Pittsburgh Democratic machine, I think again with this loss of Peduto to Gainey, I do think it is its final nail in the coffin. I do think it is dead.
Well, not to beat a dead horse, certainly we're going to be beating it next week, hopefully, with Bethany Helm going into the more granular details of what happened in Allegheny County. But I do want to add a bit of a bonus segment. By the time university starts up, the Virginia elections will be kicking off. A bit of a surprise in the convention, and is it looking good for the Republicans this fall?
Oh yeah, I'm trying to be as unbiased as I can here in my own role. Obviously, in my personal life, I do a lot of stuff over the College Republican Federation of Virginia. I'm deputy executive director there. I help out with the strategy part of what we're trying to do there as a group. But as an analyst, I think it is fair to say that this is probably the best all-around ticket I think that Republicans have had since the 2009. I am not obviously comparing that what will happen in November will be like 2009. That is not the case at all.
Right.
But certainly the thing I think that with the governor nominee, Glenn Youngkin, what I think a lot of people are missing out on is that Youngkin has explicitly promised to give some background on Youngkin. He is a former Carlyle Group CEO, which means he is an incredibly wealthy man. And he has promised to use a lot of that wealth towards down ballot races in the House of Delegates this cycle, which is going to be incredibly key for a lot of those people to keep up with the Democratic fundraising machine that has been built in Virginia these past 4 years.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
But Youngkin, the fact that he can self-fund, he can fundraise himself. Apparently, he's raised $1 million, according to himself, in the week since he has gained the nomination. But Youngkin, the fact that he can self-fund and to keep up with what will, in all honesty, very almost likely be Terry McAuliffe on the Democratic side for governor. That's going to be key for Republicans, and that's going to allow them to not necessarily have to worry so much about that side of things. But I wouldn't be lying. It is still a leans Democratic race that I have full control really over the elections daily ratings on those. And we have all 3 races that leans Democrat. And none of them would be bad enough, are bad enough to change that to likely Democrat. And we don't have enough knowledge about who the Democratic nominees are going to be, especially in the lieutenant governor's race, to shift any of those races to the right. But I do think people who are expecting it to be another 10 to 9 point win, I think could be set for disappointment. This isn't a midterm. This is an off-year election in 2021 where Virginia, to get it at those levels, still are very dependent on African American turnout and that big energy. I just don't see that happening. I think it's fair to remember too that compared from 2017 to 2019, Virginia Democrats kind of underperformed to a certain extent, especially in state Senate races. They were expected to pick up 3 to 4 seats that night. They only picked up 2.
Well, to be fair, they did decisively win the 2 seats they needed, and they just ended up on the losing side of picking up 2 more.
That is true. But compared to where those 2 seats were, which one is in a Biden which was in a Clinton double-digit district and a Clinton +4 district, and now was even greater in 2020. There is some signs that remember that these are local elections and results we pulled back down, and that turnout isn't always as high, and that I think on the Republican side, for the first time, they really do have someone who can probably generate a pretty good turnout machine with the money that Glenn Youngkin has at his personal use favor. So that's really what I'd say right now. I'm expecting like a 5-point race. I think right now is McAuliffe win, as I would say right now, looking at without any polling yet, which I think is a mistake by polling firms too, in my opinion.
They should also be polling New Mexico second.
First.
Oh, sorry, first.
It's gonna be really interesting to see and really key on whether or not where Virginia's going to go. And we've got a whole summer to go. We're only just starting the summer period here, and we have about just a little bit over 2 weeks until we see those Democratic nominees get named for all those races. So we're going to really see here very soon.
Really excited. Do you want to plug anything before we end off?
Just keep follow Elections Daily, @ Elections Daily on Twitter. That's where you're gonna see my stuff and a lot of other people's stuff when it comes to election analysis. So if you're watching Jonathan, I'm sure you're very interested in that sort of thing. So I would love to see it, to see some follows there. And if you want to see any of my personal takes, you can follow me at my personal @ Szymanski on Twitter.
And are you guys still raising money for that poll of New Mexico's first?
No, we have reached our margins there, and so polling, I would guess probably by the end of this week, we should have notice on that poll, and its expectation to be done. We did reach a little bit higher than our goal. Again, while we only showed about $1,100 on our own side, it's important to remember that we are partnering with RRH on this, and they had a decent fundraising too. I'll put in a little bit teaser here that I think will make people happy if they hear this. We are doing Spanish language calls, Spanish language only calls. So, that hopefully will give us a little bit better even on the demographic side in this very, heavily Hispanic Albuquerque based seat. So hopefully, I'm not expecting, a big result here for Republicans, but us and RH agree that it'd be good to get a benchmark of where the seat is at. And that's hopefully exactly what this polling is going to do.
Well, you heard it first on Let's Talk About Things. Joe, thank you so much for coming on, and hopefully we'll have you back again sometime.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much.